So why is Bill Gates buying up all the farmland? I wanted to discuss that today, and I have a really good article, and it just explains why these guys like Gates, Bezos, BlackRock, these different venture capitalist groups are purchasing and absorbing all this land. And so it's a rather lengthy article. It's very well documented, well cited, and we'll probably just go through part of this article. As always, we will leave the link down below so that you can cite all the sources for yourself. And like I said, it's a pretty long article, so we probably won't read through the whole thing with you. This comes from the feisty Adele. I would say Adele, but I don't know how you. I'm too much of a American, I guess. But this comes from their blog. The global public-private partnership to profit from nature, conservation as commodification. Summary. In this essay, I described the current global conservation movement for climate and biodiversity as fundamentally a means of concentrating more wealth, power, land, ownership through the commodification and privatization of nature. As we watch these synthetic infrastructures like the stock market and like these different bond type markets and like credit default swap markets that you still don't hear about, that the last time I talked to a credit default trader that was supposedly, in 2008 when the mortgage-backed securities things crashed and that became illegal, and it was closed for about 2 weeks, and then it was opened back up because it was a $17 trillion market, and the powers that be, that doesn't go well when you supposedly close that kind of stuff down. It was closed down for 2 weeks, and then reopened, and nobody even knows about it. But as these different, as all of the wealth and value get extracted from these different markets, and then they conveniently crash, they need to have the next resource to go to. And also, as they start to procure the average guy's wealth and the middle class, as they continue to abscond all that wealth, now they need new resources to go to. So now they are going to monetize nature and then extract all the value from it. The global public-private partnerships nature-positive strategy centrally depends on assigning financial value to healthy or intact nature as ecosystem services so that it can be regulated and sold through the market mechanisms they are designing through global governance. I provide detailed examples showing the arbitrary and self-serving nature of pricing ecosystem services, as well as how businesses are starting to profit from selling them. Because the wealthiest people already own a disproportionate amount of nature through concentrated land ownership, they will receive the bulk of profiting from it. I also illustrate how the nature positive movement includes the interlocking components of nature-based solutions, sustainable develop, and 30 by 30, the campaign to preserve 30% of the Earth's surface. These combined business strategies serve as a license to appropriate land, particularly in the global south, by force in large-scale land grabs. I conclude by arguing that the central problem is not that nature is undervalued in dollars, but rather that it is not universally understood as priceless. We must use the recognition as a foundation for systematic change. The GPPP poses a problem and a solution. It would be difficult to miss the increasing stridence of the global environmental movement over the last decade, especially in the last several years. By environmental movement, I mean specifically the action and advocacy of the global public-private partnership. And that's what these communists, fascists, socialists keep talking about, public-private partnerships. That's otherwise known as fascism. And that's the new normal, is this new public-private fascistic partnerships on environmental concerns as promulgated by the conventions of the parties, COP27, etc., and IUCN foundations, international conservation, and other NGOs and their corporate partners. The media inundates us on their behalf with desperate pleas for the climate, for biodiversity, for sustainable agriculture, with more and more asks from regular people, such as to change our diets, own less, wash less, travel less, and go electric. We have also seen increasingly illogical connections drawn between the dire environmental conditions and pathogens, stillbirths, heart disease, and just plain old death.
Yeah.
The GPPP of sustainability has pushed primarily to halt climate change and more recently biodiversity loss or mass extinction with a stated goal of net zero carbon emissions and a nature positive world. Nature positive business activities leave the world with more nature than they take, primarily using nature-based solutions and preserving 30% of lands and oceans by 2030, or in short, 30 by 30.
Sure.
Nature-based solutions manage ecosystems in a manner that recognizes nature's contributions to maintaining a habitable planet. For example, maintaining, creating, or restoring habitats like forests, mangroves, or rivers, or using nature in the built environment like green roofs are nature-based solutions. Well, that's how they talk about it anyway. As we live globally in a plutocratically controlled neoliberal corporatocracy in which fewer and fewer people control more and more of wealth and power, old-fashioned solutions to achieve the goal of sustainability have implicitly been written off as unrealistic. In the United States, for example, we do not have regulations that require large businesses to be nature neutral, let alone nature positive, by eliminating their pollution or restoring destroyed habitat because corporate capture of regulatory agencies and representatives is too extreme. You know what I mean? I mean the same corporations that are leading the nature positive movement. We cannot preserve 30% of our land and water in the USA for low impact public recreation conservation because the government cannot afford to buy or manage such acreage given our funding priorities, things like war, Ukraine and all that good stuff. And apparently because there is not sufficient philanthropic support from the wealthiest individuals. I'm thinking, of course, of some people who donate heavily or even pledge all their wealth to the GPPP of sustainability through international conservation organizations, their own private foundations, and public institutions. Further, while the government in the past simply took land for preservation without consent, fair compensation, or any concern for human rights whatsoever, such things are definitely frowned upon today in the USA. Given such a dire lack of potential solutions, the GPPP has the answer. Make saving nature profitable and thereby unleash the flood of capital necessary to fund their nature positive plans using market solutions. This rhetoric is everywhere. While an increase in public funding would help plug some of the gap, there needs to be a significant increase in private sector investment in nature-based solutions. That was 2021 UN program. Green Growth That Works is the first practical guide to bring together pragmatic financial and policy tools that can make investment in natural capital both attractive and commonplace. Good old Stanford. WAVES is the World Bank-led global partnership that aims to promote sustainable development by ensuring that natural resources are mainstreamed in development planning and national economic accounts. That's the good old World Bank. Hey, here's the Nature Conservancy. The scale of conservation challenges across the globe requires new and bigger sources of funding, working with investors, lenders, and companies to identify the economic value of nature. Identify the economic value of nature. We can secure financing and investments that extend the impact of our philanthropic support for the benefit of people and nature.
I doubt that.
Here, this is from The Guardian. The financial value of ecosystem services is at the heart of much of the 21st century conservation, increasingly guiding economic design making and government policy. It is on the agenda at Davos this week in the discussion about protecting the Amazon and the post-COVID economic recovery, and is likely to be a central issue in UN discussions on the Paris-style agreement on biodiversity to be negotiated in Kunming, China later this year. The global public-private partnership strategy centrally depends on assigning financial value to healthy or intact nature so that it can be regulated through the market mechanisms that are designing through global governance. And that's a little bit of part of this bait and switch on Bill Gates buying all this farmland. Oh, it's because he wants to raise bugs and they want us to eat bugs. And there's a lot of truth in that.
Yeah.
But the main reasons are they are monetizing the biodiversity. You know, they want to monetize the soil biome and everything. They're going to assign some kind of dollar value to it, whether it's a central bank digital currency dollar value, and they're monetizing it. And so obviously, therefore, the more of the nature that they own, the greater monetary value. They're just sucking up more assets, creating new assets, creating new asset classes, and prior to creating the new asset classes, they're obviously pre-positioned themselves to take full advantage of it. But this is classic, this is what they've been doing all along. Land ownership is highly concentrated, therefore so is nature ownership. To understand clearly how saving nature can be profitable, think about what it is that makes very wealthy people very wealthy. Is it the dollars they own? Is it the gold they have in their vaults? Those things are nice indeed, but they are the after effects of wealth, not the original source. Fundamentally, wealthy people's wealth springs from ownership of nature. As it is instantiated on their property, the land they or their corporations own. Unfortunately, wealth in dollars traditionally comes from transforming nature into commodities, things people buy. So how on earth can spending money to not harm nature make a tidy profit? Before answering this question, bear with me as I take a detour into the state of global land ownership, which is necessary to see the big picture of what is wrong with the nature positive movement. As it happens, wealthy people own a lot of nature, some used and some not. Wealth inequality gets a lot of attention from would-be reformers, but the underlying problem of land ownership concentration seems to get a lot less. Yet this concentration is quite extreme and growing globally. In recent investigative report by the International Land Coalition found that land inequality has been rising in most countries since 1980, and it has been underestimated due to not taking into account variations in land value or completely landless individuals. Ownership concentration of agricultural land seems to be the most well documented, as reported by the ILC. Just 1% of farms operate more than 70% of the world's farmland, including concentrated ownership in Europe, in which 3% own more than half of the farmland, and in the United States, where 7% of farms produce 80% of the food. Most estimates of ownership inequality also don't take into account control of the land. For example, farmers in Vietnam may still own their tiny farms, but many serve as contract workers within a small field, large farm model coordinated by large agribusinesses or conglomerates. Corporations and investors actually own most of the world's largest farms, of course, not farmers. As the ILC report states, parts of the world's farmland are now considered financial assets, with no known physical owners, subject to decision-making processes that may be external to the farm and the agricultural sector. The fact that land is increasingly becoming an investment also means that ownership concentration is likely to be underestimated. We do not always know who owns what land. Shareholding structures and other financial constructs are mushrooming in land and do not have to be declared in any country in the world, to our knowledge, thus remaining totally invisible. And the opacity which often surrounds the financial and activities of investment funds makes it impossible to assess the full extent of their impact on land concentration and inequality. In the United States, the only country I could find figures for, forest ownership is also very concentrated. The United States Forest Service survey covering 2011 to 13 found that 11 million ownerships owned 441 million acres, which was all the privately owned forests consisting of at least 1 acre. About 5 million of these owners were more than 9 acres, meaning that the majority of the 11 million have relatively small parcels. From these numbers, out of the national population in 2011 of 311 million, approximately 3.5% owned at least an acre of forest, just approximate because multiple people can share ownership. Maybe that doesn't sound too bad, but just 1.8% of the 11 million owners, which is again approximately 3.5% of the population, own a full 34% of all the privately owned acreage. This 1.8% of owners are corporations, Native American tribes, NGOs, and LLCs. Saving nature means the commodification of healthy nature, i.e., selling ecosystem services. Back to our question, how can spending money to leave nature alone or restore it make money? If the wealthiest people want to make saving nature profitable for themselves as owners already of large amounts of lands, they simply need to commodify healthy or what they can pass off as healthy nature. Once nature, distinct from the property it is on, has a price, it can be sold. In sum, nature positive really means a net transfer of wealth from those of us who use ecosystem services to those who own the majority of nature. This concentrationship of ownership is the key to the dysfunctional nature of this movement, because without it, theoretically, the business model could essentially look like half of the people making a living from the old form of commodifying nature, turning it into products, and the other half making a living restoring and preserving nature. Instead, what we actually have is the very same very few people profiting from doing both at the same time, while most people have to get by with less and less to live on. Yeah, you'll own nothing and be happy, right? You'll rent everything from the people that actually own it.
Yep.
And this is all part of the consolidation of wealth. The process of commodification and privatization of healthy nature is at the heart of the GPPP's nature positive movement, which involves several interlocking components: selling ecosystem services, sustainable development. And what did the NASA guy say? Dennis Bushnell. He said that the code word is sustainable, and really what it means is you'll own less.
Yeah.
The code word for sustainability is, you'll own less. You need less stuff. It's all about a redistribution of wealth, and it's taking away from the average guy and giving it to the elites that have already accumulated.
The 1%.
The 1%ers, yeah. Sustainable development and the 30 by 30 plan, or fortress conservation, privatizing land used by indigenous and local inhabitants in a manner that keep them out. A tree farm provides an example of how the components overlap. It may be an acceptable form of sustainable development within a protected area. Mining is actually quite common in protected areas. In addition to wood products, the farm may also sell ecosystem services in the form of carbon or biodiversity offsets.
Yep.
Yeah, think green credits, y'all. I don't know if any of you remember when the whole solar scam thing started and came out, and there was these, Al Gore started all this green credits, and you could buy carbon offsets of these green Shreks and these certificates, and they lasted like less than 3 years, and and that's how they were selling solar. Say probably 10 years ago, is that these Shrek certificates you're going to generate every month are going to, pay off your solar system. And maybe they were around for a year or two, but they quickly evaporated. It may even employ best management practices around streams and rivers, allowing it to further benefit by enrolling in a water fund, which sells clean water to those downstream. Since land ownership is the key to sustainable regenerative profit through selling nature, the proposal to set aside 30% of the Earth's surfaces as wilderness by 2030 to promote biodiversity and climate health serves primarily as an excuse for large-scale land grabs. And instead of encouraging people to grow their own food
Yep.
on their own property in a regenerative agriculture, self-sustainable, and to take the personal responsibility to do that, is the solution is for NGOs and for governments to just take the land from everybody, and
Yeah.
they claim that they're going to do it. And to see any government anywhere on planet Earth to ever do anything in a way that benefits anybody but themselves. And when they do fail tremendously and catastrophically, it's always blamed on incompetence and all these different things. But it was actually the original intent was for it to fail catastrophically. And I find it very interesting, and I wonder how liberals can maintain this idea that of regulation and governance and government as these governments become more tyrannical and more despotic and more incompetent, aka quote unquote incompetent. But yet we need, the way we fix this is through regulation and more governance and more government, and just think, this all fits hand in glove with this ESG stuff. It's the same thing. It's all hand in glove here. 30 by 30 is a license for the wealthy to appropriate land in the global south by force. Currently, 16% of the earth is in preservation, with 2/3 of that in the global south. While the 30 by 30 proposal asserts the goal is to set aside land on earth, in practice it largely means in the global south, which contains the majority of biodiversity hotspots. Critically, land in the global south is also by far the easiest to preserve due to the community-based customary tenure rights rather than legally recognized ownerships. While stealing land from people through coercion or force is frowned upon in the USA today, as I mentioned, it is much easier to clear local inhabitants off of desired parcels in the global south. Indigenous people and local communities use or manage 50% of the world's surface collectively, but legally only own between 10 and 20% of it. Similarly, 90% of the land in rural Africa does not have documented ownership. And of course, just like the global corporations have been abusing all these countries and stealing all their resources for about 100 years now, of course, they're going to continue to steal all their land.
Of course.
While lack of clear title makes it easier for conservation NGOs and other corporations to appropriate territories, force is still required. Despite much talk about working with the community, conservation in the global south is a highly militarized operation. People are not merely evicted from their land, but shot, raped, tortured, and killed. The scale of the problem is great enough that there is currently a bill winding its way through the U.S. Congress to halt funding for conservation agencies and projects that engage in human rights abuses. Survival International, a key organization working for the rights of indigenous people, reports regarding the bill's justification. At present, much of the $78 to $91 billion a year spent on biodiversity conservation globally goes towards forest conservation, which evicts and excludes indigenous and local people from their ancestral lands and employs guards who perpetrate appalling abuses. And there's a video here that's attached where they explain that in the Big Lie. You can watch that when you get a chance. NGOs are too often brokers between the wealthy, business, and government. Some may wonder whether it is fair to equate for-profit corporations appropriating land for sustainable development enterprises with non-profit conservation NGOs seeking to preserve land. Unfortunately, these two types of corporations are tightly interwoven at this point. Transitional conservation is dominated by mostly 5 international NGOs from the global north, with combined assets equal to the gross national product of many African countries, and have strong ties to extractive industries and finance institutions. A quick look at the leadership team of the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, World Wildlife Fund, Wildlife Conservation Society and African Parks shows a panel full of CEOs, billionaires, investment bankers from financial institutions like Goldman Sachs, Merrill, and Blackstone. So there you go. It's the same usual suspects,
Yep.
and they do all this stuff, and they seize this wealth, and they consolidate and liquidate it, and it's all in the name of, saving the environment or saving the kids, or
Yep.
it's always the opposite. Their title is always the opposite of what they're actually doing. I used to think of conservation NGOs as philanthropic organizations. People donate to them, and they spend the money to save nature. Now I know that is old school. Today, these NGOs are more like brokers between governments and corporations, working to create novel schemes utilizing new forms of financing to advance their missions at whatever cost in human life, freedom, and equality. The NGOs themselves don't make a profit. They just facilitate the wealth and land ownership. Finish reading this. It's a lot of really good information. All the hyperlinks are links to different documentation, so I encourage you to check that out. But if you want to know why BlackRock is buying all this private property, and why Bill Gates and why Bezos and why these other venture capitalists, and how they're also doing it clandestinely through their other venture capitalist firms that they own indirectly or directly, this is why they're monetizing. They're going to be monetizing this whole green agenda. They're going to monetize it, and then they're going to extract it. And that's why they are pre-positioning themselves. And that's what it's all about. So I hope you found this interesting. Maybe you saw something that you haven't seen here yet before. Comment down below. Let us know what you think. And we just appreciate y'all. And we'll see y'all in the next video. You got anything else, Matt? You want to?
No.
See? Okay.
I think it was good.
All right.
All right.
All right.
See y'all
We'll see
later.
y'all.
All right. Bye-bye.